Morning. We're going to go ahead and get started, and appreciate this early Friday morning. We're going to call the Subcommittee on Capital Outlay and Transportation to order. We're going to go through a number of different things this morning. We're going to go through the overview of budgets and member requests, and then followed up by transportation budget related items from member requests. And with that, we have a quorum, and we're going to get started with Tyler Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McPike. Today we're going to go over the capital outlay funding budget. I just wanted to remind you the capital outlay planning process and the 6-year project advisory committee. So we have a capital outlay plan that was codified in 2008. It's a business-like approach. I think we've mentioned this before. 6-pack made up of the Secretary of Finance, directors of DGS, Department of Planning and Budget. The 2 staff directors of the Money Committee serve also on 6-pack. They analyze and recommend projects to the governor for inclusion in the 6-year plan, but you've also tasked them with more implementation of capital related to the capital supplements and higher ed. There's kind of 2 processes. I think we've gone over this enough, but you can either be in a pool process or a standalone projects process. Pool process, we kind of transfer money around the pools based on where we are based on the initial cost estimation until we get further cost refinements. Standalone is more non-general fund projects or improvements or umbrella projects. So now moving to the proposed budgets. In Senate Bill 29, so that's the caboose bill, there's 3 actions related to capital outlay. There's a reversion of $5 million for an unused dredging projects at the Virginia Port Authority. There's an additional non-general fund inclusion for forestry to acquire more land at the Charlotte State Forest. And then there's a conversion of a Virginia State project that's mainly campus water infrastructure, moving it from a pool project to a standalone project. This project was authorized in 2013, so it's one of the remaining projects in that pool that hasn't initiated to construction yet. Turning to the big bills, so this is Senate Bill 30. The introduced budget from the governor proposes $1.2 billion in general fund and general fund tax supported debt. The total capital outlay program is $2.1 billion, and we'll go into a little more detail on each of those projects in the next few slides. When you turn to slide 7, this shows you how the capital outlay funding breaks down by project type. So most of Senate Bill 30 is really focused on deferred maintenance, improvements to existing facilities or maintenance reserve. The line in the middle of the table, new construction, you see there's no general fund cash or debt for new construction, but there is non-general fund cash and non-general fund debt. So that means there's a Virginia State project for a student housing, and that's backed by 9C debt. And then there's a $30 million non-general fund cash for an indoor small arms firing range at the Department of Military Affairs, the State Military Reservation in Virginia Beach. But this is really funded with funds from the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project from Dominion. That was the negotiated agreement between the administration and Dominion on bringing the landing there. And that's $30 million, and then the other $35 million is transferred to the general fund in Senate Bill 29.
And Tyler?
Yes.
Is there an a requisite operating budget associated with the pistol range? And that's an indoor pistol range, correct?
Senator McPike, yes, it is indoor. I don't know if there's a corresponding operating increase. I'll check with Katie, who does public safety, if they received more operating in the governor's proposed budget for that facility.
I appreciate it. Indoor firing ranges are incredibly expensive. Not that it's not needed, but if you do the lead filter changes on those appropriately per month, those can run you up to $40,000, depending on the size and filtration system of those ranges, to make sure that lead does not contaminate personnel within that range. And so I just want to make sure to note that as a follow-up.
Definitely will. and we're going to go in a little more detail, but I would point out there's $81 million for equipment for capital projects that are coming online within the next 18 months. And then there's $22 million for equipment for the higher education institutions related to the Tech Talent Investment Program, the Amazon deal. Turning to maintenance reserve, I think we've discussed this one before, but I wanted to point it out. So they proposed $404 million for maintenance reserve. This is in the first year only. So typically you would split fund it over both years, even though the funding from the first year can roll over to the second year. But by placing it only in the first year, you're creating a base budget problem for the next biennium, because maintenance reserve really should be an ongoing capital project that you're doing every biennium. And so when you don't have any dollars in the second year, you really have a base budget problem going forward. So that's one issue. They also proposed $4 million of the Department of General Services allocation to be used to convert legislative offices and the parking deck that the General Assembly currently uses, and they want to convert that to retail space. They recommend transferring Eastern Virginia Medical School's allocations and any prior year balances to Old Dominion University upon the merging of those institutions. And then they recommend language allowing military affairs to use maintenance reserve for a National Guard youth program. That language is really a continuation from Chapter 1. You directed Department of Military Affairs to use maintenance reserve for the National Guard youth program at the state military, or at Camp Pendleton, sorry. Turning to slide 9, these are the proposed deferred maintenance and improvements. You'll see on the left, they are deferred maintenance umbrella projects for the higher education institutions. These are funded with general fund debt that total $87 million. And then when you look on the right, you see the standalone improvement projects, which include a mix of state agencies and higher ed institutions. And what you don't see is any cross-pollination between an umbrella project or an improvement project. So if an institution got an umbrella project, they really don't have an improvement project, and vice versa. If they got an improvement project, they don't have a deferred maintenance umbrella project. There's $50 million for Fort Monroe Authority for renovation and repair of Fort Monroe. There's $50 million for the renovation of office space for the Monroe building tenants, and then to demolish Monroe. It's about $20 million for the moving cost and $30 million for the demolition, based on the conversation we've had with the Secretary of Administration. Most of the Monroe building tenants would be going to Main Street Center. Lottery would be moving out of Main Street Center to lease space, and then other agencies would be consolidating in Main Street Center to a smaller footprint. And a few agencies from Monroe will be going to Old City Hall, Reed's Row, and the Auditor of Public Accounts is not included in the plan, and so they're seeking outside lease space. But that is not, they're not funded for their moving cost out of that $20 million.
Senator Locke.
Sorry, Senator Locke.
So has a decision been made that Monroe will be demolished and not leased or sold?
Senator McPike, Senator Locke, it is under your purview to decide what proceeds with Monroe and a new construction of a state office building at 7th and Main. There's $35 million umbrella or improvement project, which is really an infrastructure fund for DBHDS to renovate and repair their facilities. There's an improvement and security enhancement at Eastern State Hospital. There's $15 million for a DOC capital infrastructure fund, and then there's improvement of campus infrastructure at Norfolk State, an improvement of the south entrance and campus security at Virginia State, and campus accessibility at Virginia Tech. DCR, there's a removal of underground storage tanks. These are gasoline usually. And then there's an improvement for improving readiness centers. That's $3 million to match federal money of $9 million to plan for the improvement of readiness centers. And then there's debt proposed for state parks to add climate control to state park yurts. Turning to slide 10, so in the planning pool, there are 3 projects proposed for planning. There's the renovation of the State Library building on Broad Street. There's renovation of Darden Hall at University of Virginia at Wise, and then there's planning for DBHDS for the Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Treatment Facility. Total, this is $26.6 million with a split between general fund and non-general fund. And then you'll see the supplements. There's $250 million to supplement projects that have cost overruns. This is added to the 2022 supplement pool, which SFAC helps administer and figure out the appropriate amounts. And then there's $50 million proposed to supplement the 2022 state agency capital pool, which includes this. It's for the State Police Training Academy, and there's language capping the project cost to $100 million for state police. I do want to also note that I forgot one project, the courts building. You'll remember that you authorized construction for a new courts building, which is going to sit on the Pocahontas site where you previously were. They've proposed to add language that would require the justices of the Supreme Court and the Appeals Court to work in consultation with the Department of General Services to figure out what the scope is going forward. You authorized a project of 315,000 square feet in Chapter 1, which was based on the recommendation given to SFAC by DGS at the time last summer. Turning to the capital construction pools, so you'll see there are a state agent.
Senator McDougall.
Was there another piece to that? You said we authorized it. Is it going to be something than what we originally contemplated?
Senator McPike, Senator McDougall, I believe 315,000 square feet will accommodate the courts today, but it will be a tight space. And I think what I've heard from DGS and the Office of the Executive Secretary is there's some additional square footage that they would like so the building lasts and there's space for the next 100 years for the courts to grow.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator McDougall.
If my recollection is it was only those two courts, the Court of Appeals, which we've expanded, and the Supreme Court. Were there any other courts contemplated being housed there?
Senator McPike, Senator McDougall, there are no other contemplation of courts to be housed on that site. I think there's discussions or thoughts around potentially that not being the site for the courts building maybe, and we can talk about that more. Okay, turning to the capital construction pools, there are two capital construction pools. There's the state agency capital pool, and then there's the higher education capital pool. You'll see there are two projects in the state agency pool for Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, replacement of a walkway and improvement of lightings, a replacement of roofs, and the Emerson Central Support Complex. There's addressing of heating and hot water issues at Hiram Davis, which is at Central State. And then there's the renovation of Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Facility at DJJ. That project, we are rescinding the previous juvenile justice facility at Bon Air, and we are reauthorizing a new one that meets a new scope based on what the programmatic needs of DJJ were. And that was kind of a recommendation of SFAC to start over because there had been so many changes since we originally contemplated that project. And then in the higher ed pool, there are projects for, and most of these are replacement or renovations or improvements, no new construction. So at William & Mary, the renovation of the historic campus is the Wren building for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. At VMI, there's the replacement of windows. Longwood, there's the replacement of a steam distribution system. James Madison, improvement of infrastructure. Richard Bland, there's the HVAC system for Statesman Hall, and then Christopher Newport, replacement of their integrated center, science center, fume hoods, and pressurization valves. Sorry about that. Now turning to the non-general fund projects. At William & Mary, there's supplement for their renovation of dormitories project. This is 9C bonds. At James Madison, we see the blanket property acquisition that they've had in previous budgets. Also at James Madison, renovation of Spotswood Hall, which is a housing facility with 9C debt. At Virginia Commonwealth, the construction of a new school of dentistry, they are authorized for planning of $5.2 million. There's also language that the school should work and present a plan to SFAC on potential site options for a new dental school. Originally, you'll remember the dental school, as they've proposed, would be on the old public safety building that Richmond now has the deed to. At VMI, there's the renovation of Crozet Hall, which is a dining facility with non-general fund cash. There's the renovation of a soccer and lacrosse field and a related locker room with non-general fund cash. the Virginia State 9C new construction of a new student housing, and then at Virginia State, their extension facility. This is federal funding to renovate the cooperative extension building there.
Mr. Chairman, just because I don't know, when we say non-general fund cash, does that come from where? Student fees, donations? What does that mean?
Senator McPike.
Or is it different for each one?
Senator McPike, Senator McDougall, it is different for each one. So it could be higher education operating, which would be from tuition and fees, or it could be from donations that they've received from donors. Or federal in some cases for Virginia State's extension program. So it is a mix. Turning to slide 13, these are non-general fund projects at other agencies. DCR, there's $2.7 million for the acquisition of land for state parks. The Department of Wildlife Resources, there's $10 million in non-general fund cash for acquisition of land and property. There's $2 million from federal funding for maintenance reserve projects at the Department of Military Affairs. There's the $30 million non-general fund cash from the Dominion Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Landing at the State Military Reservation. And I will note there's also a parking lot over the cable landing, and so it's more than just the firing range in that scope of project. There's $9 million. This is the $9 million for the improvement of the readiness centers that matches the $3 million state funding. There's $49 million in federal non-general fund cash for construction of a microgrid emergency backup generator at the State Military Reservation. $6.4 million for converting the Southwest Virginia Readiness Center to a regional field maintenance shop, which I believe is in Marion. And then there's a Treasury loan of $5 million for Department of Veteran Services to expand the Veterans Cemetery in Suffolk, and that would be paid back with federal funds. Now turning to the transportation projects, there's $2 million for maintenance reserve for DMV. There's $14.8 million to renovate the DMV headquarters here in Richmond on Broad Street. And Senator McDougall, we confirmed with DMV that really it is to reconfigure the second floor of that building for the IT department. They want more collaborative small space based on the way that they're competing with recent graduates who are going to other companies and doing IT work. We did follow up on the sidewalk issue, and I believe Kendra confirmed that they may have pressure washed the sidewalk to make it cleaner, but that was all that they are doing there. There's $10 million for maintenance reserve for across all of VDOT's facilities. There's $70 million to continue acquisition, design, construction, and renovation of agency facilities. That's $70 million. I will note there's about $95,000 general fund related to selling, essentially VDOT transferred a property to DOC. DOC then sold the property, so there's a code section that says half of the sale goes back to VDOT, so that is that $95,000. There's $223 million for the Port Authority to support an existing project for the cargo handling facilities. There's $223 to expand empty yard, which is also an existing project at the Port Authority. And then there's $12 million to maintain the berths and wharfs at the Port Authority. Slide 15, I'm not going to go into the detail. This is more just for how they propose to move bond transfers. So anytime there's any unused bonds or a project may have excess or need to be rescinded, we will then transfer it back to another pool that may have a short in it. And there are shorts in the 2016 or 2019 pools. And so you see the movement of VCBA bonds to the VCBA pool in 2016, and the same with the VPA bonds. They're moved to the 2019 pool. I will note there are two general funds. One is the Virginia Extension Relocation of Hampton Roads, AREC. The extension has completed the planning for a potential move of those facilities and determined it's not feasible or cost efficient. And then there's the redirection of general funds that was provided to the Department of Forestry for the acquisition of a forest tract at Conway Robinson. There was no local match, which was required by the Appropriation Act. So this project is the funds are being redirected to that 2016 pool. I'll pause there if there are any questions or move on. Okay. Now moving on to language changes. There are several language changes related to SFAC, the Capital Plan Advisory Committee. So this proposes language that would require the committee to submit the 6-year plan as a report to the governor and General Assembly based on the projects that are authorized for planning in an appropriation act. Currently, the plan is a piece of legislation that's introduced every year, and it does not always reflect the projects authorized in the Enrolled Appropriation Act because we passed the legislation for the plan prior to the budget and we never kind of matched them up. So this would be done, this report would be done after the fact to now match to make sure anything that's approved for planning in the budget, it's in the 6-year capital outlay plan. There's language allowing the committee to meet electronically and at least 4 times. There are certain bond pools that require us to meet at least 4 times, but this would add allowing us to meet electronically. There's language requiring the committee to review and recommend if state-supported projects that have not proceeded to construction within 5 years, should those projects remain authorized or be rescinded, which is usually an executive function proposed in the budget. And then there's language exempting written communication among committee members and their staff from FOIA. The exemptions specifically apply to the availability of funding in an authorized capital pool, the estimated total capital outlay project cost of a project, supplemental capital pool funding available, project authorization, and the transfer of appropriations. Really, that's just trying to maintain that the cost of capital projects that are not publicly known so we can compete for the best price, but still allow the communication between the legislative branch and the executive branch and maintain that confidentiality. Now turning to Part 4, proposed language. There's language proposing that the Tier 3 higher education institutions have to provide a 25% match for any cost of a capital project that supports educational and general programs. However, this would not apply to projects that address maintenance, life safety, security, or infrastructure, and it also would not apply to VIMS, UVA-Wise, or Virginia Tech's Cooperative Extension Program, but would apply to those Tier 3 institutions. There's language proposing to clarify the criteria for lease and finance purchase agreements that require approval in the appropriation. And it also allows the governor to authorize building projects or acquisition of property through a financed purchase that are not currently authorized in an appropriation act or other legislation. And he could do, or they could do so if the non-general fund share of lease obligations do not exceed the agency's expected non-general fund revenue, or if the general fund share of annual lease obligations do not result in the agency exceeding its current available general fund appropriation. So kind of to summarize that, the governor could authorize and initiate capital projects without approval by the General Assembly if he determines there's sufficient non-general fund revenue or general fund revenue to support that.
Tyler, I guess as a follow-up to that point, entering to leases independent of authorization creates a moral obligation of the Commonwealth to cover should revenues fall below expected projections. Is that correct?
Senator McPike, yes. Long-term obligations like leases are included in our debt capacity because we are responsible for the payment. And then there's proposals in Part 4, which are the general conditions for capital outlay to establish new capital outlay funding requirements. This would require that 1% of general fund revenues be targeted to address deferred maintenance at existing state facilities. And it would also propose limiting annual general fund supported capital spending, which would include general fund cash plus any tax-supported debt to 1% of the total annual general fund revenue plus annual debt capacity plus any non-reappropriated prior year expended general fund balances. You already have kind of a requirement that debt service can't exceed 5% of general fund revenues if you were to pay for capital with all debt. So we can continue to discuss that language and its implications. I'm going to stop there if there are any questions about proposed projects in the budget before moving to member request. Okay. So turning to member amendments. So what you see here are a list of all the member amendments submitted. I want to say that the total state-supported general fund requests, so that would be general fund cash or general fund debt that you would be responsible for, totals $1.7 billion. A lot of those, when you look through the list, are really related to new construction because the proposed budget includes very limited new construction. And so those first two lines on the first sheet are related to Senate Bill 29. So there were two requests in Senate Bill 29. One's a language request for Mary Washington for the acquisition and renovation of a multi-use building. There's a request for a supplement for the Department of Historic Resources to construct Claremont Farm Barn replacement, which burned down, I believe, in 2018, and we have insurance recovery money, but it's not enough for the project. And then lines 3 through 52 are all related to Senate Bill 30. And so, I mean, most of this page you see the higher ed institutions. A lot of them are focused on, some of them are focused on new construction and some of them are focused on renovations. You see some requests further down on that page related to Gunston Hall. And then on the next page, you see things related to Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, DBHDS, DCR, and then some requests later on for the higher education institutions to have new construction projects put in the pool. Senator McPike, we usually go in more detail later with members on these requests as we get closer to budget development, so I'll let Kendra go to transportation next unless we have questions on capital.
Any questions on capital? All right, thank you, Todd.
Thanks.
Kendra?
Good morning. Similar to what Tyler went over this morning, I'm going to start off with an overview of what is included in the governor's introduced budget, and then we'll move on to member requests and just touch briefly on those in anticipation of further discussions. The governor's introduced budget provides net increases totaling $92.2 million general fund and negative $612 million non-general fund over the biennium. The general fund request for transportation includes $70 million for improvements to I-81 specific to mile markers in the Christiansburg area, $20 million for a deposit to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund, and that is the fund from which the governor can direct money towards economic development projects and road improvements associated with those projects. And then $2.3 million in general fund support for port grant programs. And those are grant programs that the General Assembly took action last session to move from being tax credits to being grant programs. And so that's the general fund support for those making those grant payments. The introduced budget also includes language requiring the Secretary of Transportation to approve increased funding for WMATA. And this is any funding in excess of the maximum 3% cap on increases. And the way it works under the current code, if WMATA submits a budget to the Commonwealth that requests more than a 3% increase in funding over the prior year, then Virginia can withhold 35% of the funding. So this would override that code requirement. And then additional language also outlines some requirements for WMATA to come up with cost savings and a budget approach. And then also there's some capital outlay funding that Tyler's already touched on. And this just summarizes the numbers that are included in the introduced bill. I'll pause here if there's any questions about anything that was in the introduced budget before we moved on to the proposed amendments.
Senator McPike and members, I just wanted to remind members that the governor's proposed budget expands the sales tax base to include digital personal property and certain taxable services related to digital, and the additional revenue generated and dedicated to transportation, the 0.9% of sales and use tax, From the expanded tax basis distributed half to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund and then the other half to the Interstate 81 Corridor Fund until the date of June 30th, 2031, or a total of $400 million is deposited. So those were transportation actions related in Part 4.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler.
All right, moving on to the proposed budget amendments. I'll just touch briefly on a couple of these items on the slide, and we'll have further discussions later on as we get closer to the budget. But I did want to kind of remind the committee that traditionally the General Assembly's approach is to limit the general fund amount that goes in towards transportation projects. Although we have over the years put some pretty significant pots in when necessary. So. Just to touch on a couple of things on the first slide before we move on, there is the first item is a language proposal which would deal with land use in being used as part of the smart scale allocation and how that is handled by the Department of Transportation. There's also, you'll see for item number 5, there's a request for DMV to provide some Virginia driver's license manuals in all the 24 languages in which they provide the driver's knowledge test. Line 10, there is some general fund support requested to implement some sealing and expungement legislation that was passed by the General Assembly. Line 11, you will see, is a request for some general fund support, additional general fund support for the Washington Metro, $65 million. And then that's followed on line 12 by a language which would mirror the language in the introduced bill for the exemption from the 3% increase requirement.
What, on line 3, what is a collector license plate? Is that license plate readers by another name?
Senator McPike, Senator McDougal, that is not. That is related to some legislation which is currently making its way through the Senate, which would allow for a collector plate, which would operate somewhat similarly to the antique plate for a vehicle, for collector vehicles. So that appropriation will happen or not happen depending on the fate of the legislation. Moving on to the next slide, you will see on line 16 some funding for the work on the I-73 Southern Connector. There's also a request for on line 18 for an extension of a road in Greenville County. And then on line 21, there's a request for $295 million general fund in the first year and $365 million general fund in the second year for I-81 safety improvements. And there's on line 22, you'll see.
Was there a corresponding revenue increase to that? I'm just kidding.
Senator McPike, I did not see that in my analysis, no. On line 22, there is some funding for intersection improvements of Weirs Cave Road. And then you will also see there's some study language and some pilot project language. And there's on line 28, there's additional funding for assistance to the port cities, and they receive an allocation from the transportation funding to deal with the road damage from the big trucks moving through on their way to the port. Are there any additional questions? Thank you.
Well, I believe that completes our agenda for the morning. Lots of information for this committee to follow up, and appreciate the staff's work to help set the stage for the next couple of weeks. For those coming in, we will have some bills to consider next week in this subcommittee, and the committee will rise. Happy Friday.